From the very beginning, empaths carry a quiet, almost invisible power, the ability to feel deeply, to connect profoundly, and to intuit the emotional currents around them. This is a gift that allows them to respond to others with extraordinary compassion, often before a word is even spoken. But like any gift, it can be misused, both by the empath themselves and, unfortunately, by those around them. The first step in understanding why an empath disappears from someone's life begins with noticing what happens when their kindness is not only unappreciated but actively exploited. Empaths are naturally inclined to give. They offer understanding when others are misunderstood. They offer patience when others are impatient. They offer care when others are hurting. And because they feel the world so deeply, they often extend this energy in ways that feel natural, almost effortless. But this generosity is not limitless. It has boundaries, even if those boundaries are subtle and take time to assert. The moment an empath begins to notice that their kindness is being used as a tool rather than a gift, something fundamental shifts. It rarely happens all at once. At first, the empath may notice small signs, a request that feels like manipulation, a compliment that carries hidden obligation, or a favor that seems to create debt rather than connection. They may brush it off, rationalize it, or convince themselves that the other person is simply struggling or unaware. But over time, the pattern becomes undeniable. The empathy they offered freely is not reciprocated. It is leveraged. Their patience is not appreciated. It is expected. Their care is not cherished. It is exploited. And this is where the turning point occurs. Empaths are not naive, though they may appear so. They have a keen awareness of emotional reality, often more acute than most. When they recognize that someone is taking advantage of their emotional generosity, the response is not immediate drama, but a quiet recalibration. Internally, the empath begins to withdraw, not out of anger, but out of a profound sense of self-preservation. The realization is simple yet profound. If my kindness is being weaponized, it is no longer safe to invest in this person. This withdrawal is subtle at first. They may stop offering explanations for their feelings. They may stop going out of their way to accommodate unreasonable requests. They may begin conserving emotional energy that was once poured into maintaining the connection. And this is the beginning of the empath's disappearance, not in a dramatic confrontation, but in a slow, quiet disengagement that is nearly imperceptible to the other person until it is complete. It is important to understand why this happens. Empaths are not abandoning relationships lightly. They are responding to a mismatch between their values and the reality of the other person's behavior. Empathy is not weakness. It is a form of strength that demands integrity. When that integrity is continuously violated, continuing to give becomes unsustainable. The empath begins to reclaim their energy, their emotional focus, and ultimately their life. And this is the first lesson in why an empath disappears. It is never about revenge, manipulation, or spite. It is about recognition that their generosity is being used, that their emotional labor is unreciprocated, and that their well-being must come first. Once that recognition crystallizes, the empath no longer negotiates for understanding. They no longer justify their giving. They simply choose themselves. In the end, the empath's disappearance is a quiet act of self-preservation, a reclaiming of the emotional space that was once surrendered. It is not a retreat born of fear, but a deliberate step toward clarity, health, and integrity When someone truly sees the pattern of exploitation, the only rational response is to step away, and in that departure lies the first true demonstration of the empath's inner strength. Because an empath does not vanish into emptiness, they disappear in order to reappear whole, centered, and free. One of the defining traits of an empath is their sensitivity to emotional nuance. They do not merely observe feelings, they experience them. They absorb them, they reflect them, and they respond to them with a depth that often surprises those around them. This ability to connect so fully, however, comes with both immense strength and remarkable vulnerability. And one of the most dangerous experiences for an empath is when their emotional reality is repeatedly dismissed. This is the second trigger that quietly propels an empath out of a relationship or connection. The realization that their feelings, their perceptions, their very experience of the world are not being acknowledged. At first, this dismissal may appear subtle. Perhaps a feeling is minimized with a casual, "you're overreacting," or an experience is reframed as unimportant. "It wasn't that bad." For most people, these might seem like minor slights, easily forgiven or ignored. But for an empath whose internal life is intensely felt, repeated invalidation is corrosive. Their emotional input is what allows them to navigate the world and connect authentically with others. When that input is consistently denied or trivialized, it signals that the core of their being, their very ability to sense, understand, and respond, is being devalued. Empaths are naturally patient and tolerant. They often give others the benefit of the doubt, assuming misunderstanding or oversight rather than malice. They may rationalize repeated invalidation, telling themselves, "Maybe I misinterpreted it. Perhaps they didn't mean it that way." But the human psyche is finely attuned to patterns, and repeated dismissal forms a pattern that cannot be ignored indefinitely. The empath begins to recognize a silent but powerful truth. My experience does not matter to this person. This recognition is profoundly destabilizing. To live authentically, an empath requires acknowledgement. Validation is not merely a comfort, it is a psychological necessity. Without it, their sense of self becomes strained under the weight of constant self-questioning. When someone consistently dismisses or minimizes their feelings, the empath is forced to negotiate with reality in a way that is exhausting and unsustainable. Their inner compass, which once guided them with clarity, becomes muddied. Over time, this lack of acknowledgement begins to erode their willingness to remain emotionally invested in the relationship. The withdrawal of an empath in these situations is rarely dramatic. There is often no confrontation or accusation. Instead, it manifests as a quiet disengagement, a subtle reduction of emotional availability, a reluctance to share feelings, a decreasing investment in attempts to be understood. It is a protective mechanism. The empath recognizes that continuing to pour energy into someone who consistently dismisses their reality is ultimately self-destructive. This process is not about punishing the other person or creating distance out of spite. Rather, it is about preservation and restoration. The empath begins redirecting attention back to their own internal reality, where it belongs. They nurture their own sense of worth, validate their own experiences, and cultivate a psychological space in which they can exist without constant denial. The consequence of repeated dismissal is profound. The empath, once fully present and deeply connected, starts to recede, not because they lack compassion, but because they have realized that empathy without acknowledgement is a form of emotional self-erasure. They withdraw not to hurt, but to survive. And this is the lesson that emerges clearly. When an empath's emotional reality is dismissed, they do not argue endlessly or beg for recognition. They do something far more powerful. They disappear. They retreat from the environment that invalidates them, reclaiming their energy, their clarity, and their sense of self. In the end, their disappearance is an act of quiet dignity. It is a refusal to accept a world in which their feelings are irrelevant. And it stands as a reminder to anyone who would underestimate the inner life of an empath. Their presence is not given lightly, and their withdrawal is not inconsequential. It is a reclaiming of the very essence that makes them profoundly human. One of the most subtle yet profound ways an empath disappears from a relationship is when they begin to notice patterns of manipulation. At first, it may not even be obvious. The empath, by nature, approaches others with openness and trust. They assume goodwill, they seek understanding, and they often interpret actions in the best possible light. But over time, repeated patterns of dishonesty, gaslighting, or emotional manipulation begin to reveal themselves. The empath senses the distortion, not just intellectually, but viscerally. Their body, their intuition, and their emotional awareness all register that something is amiss. Empaths are finely attuned to the emotional resonance of those around them. They can feel shifts in tone, subtle contradictions in behavior, or inconsistencies between words and actions. In the early stages of manipulation, they may question themselves, am I misreading this? Is this my perception or is it real? But as the manipulation continues, the empath's clarity grows. They begin to recognize a pattern. What once seemed like isolated incidents now forms a consistent thread of control or deceit. This recognition is both painful and illuminating. It forces the empath to confront a reality they often wish did not exist, that not everyone they care about acts in alignment with truth or integrity. It is a form of cognitive and emotional dissonance. The deep desire to connect and trust clashes with the emerging awareness of ongoing manipulation. Empaths who naturally prioritize emotional honesty cannot ignore this contradiction indefinitely. Once the pattern is recognized, a quiet shift begins. Unlike those who react with overt confrontation, empaths often retreat internally. First, they analyze the behavior, weigh the implications, and begin to mentally distance themselves from the manipulation. They may test the waters with boundaries or gentle confrontation, only to find that their attempts at honesty are met with deflection, denial, or further manipulation. And this is the point at which the empath begins to consider disappearance, not as an act of aggression, but as a necessary form of self-preservation. Manipulation in its various forms, gaslighting, guilt tripping, or emotional coercion, thrives on access. It thrives on attention, on engagement, on the willingness of the other person to justify or rationalize the distorted reality. The empath, by engaging inadvertently, sustains the manipulator's pattern. But once the empath recognizes the structural nature of the manipulation, they withdraw that energy. Their disappearance is not impulsive. It is strategic, deliberate, and protective. They are reclaiming the emotional space that manipulation has eroded. This process also reveals something deeper about the empath's psychological resilience. Survival is not only about leaving the relationship, it is about preserving the integrity of their own perception. The empath begins to trust their inner compass again, learning to distinguish between authentic connection and deceitful appearances. The withdrawal is a signal that they will no longer compromise their truth for the sake of maintaining a relationship built on manipulation. What is remarkable is how quiet this disappearance often is. There is rarely confrontation or spectacle. The empath does not announce their departure to punish the other person. Instead, they gradually reduce engagement, reclaim boundaries, and over time remove themselves entirely from the manipulative dynamic. In doing so, they protect their psychological and emotional well being in a way that is both subtle and profound. Ultimately, this is the third reason an empath disappears. Manipulation breaks the unspoken contract of trust that allows connection to flourish. When that trust is repeatedly violated, the empath's response is natural, inevitable, and deeply wise. They withdraw to protect their inner truth, reclaim their energy, and create space for relationships that are grounded in honesty, respect, and authenticity. The empath's disappearance, therefore, is not retreat. It is an act of preservation. It is this quiet assertion that their emotional truth cannot be compromised, that manipulation will no longer govern the terms of their life. In walking away, they do not merely leave a toxic dynamic behind, they reclaim the very foundation of their being. And in doing so, they remind us all of the power of integrity in the face of distortion. Another pivotal reason an empath disappears from a relationship emerges when their boundaries are ignored. This moment is often gradual and imperceptible at first. Empaths are naturally giving, naturally attuned to the needs of others. They often prioritize emotional connection over self-interest, believing that care and understanding are the glue of meaningful relationships. But this very generosity can become a vulnerability when met with disregard or repeated boundary violations. Boundaries are the silent architecture of emotional health. They are the lines that define where one person ends and another begins. For an empath who often absorbs emotions so deeply that the edges between self and other blur, boundaries are essential for preserving clarity, stability, and well-being. When boundaries are consistently ignored, whether through repeated demands, disrespect for personal time, or dismissive treatment, the empath experiences a profound internal alarm. Their generosity, once freely given, is now being treated as an entitlement by others. Initially, empaths may attempt subtle corrections. They might express their needs indirectly, hoping the other person will notice or adjust. They may rationalize, thinking perhaps the violations were unintentional or contextual. But as these violations persist, the empath's inner awareness grows sharper. They begin to see a pattern. Respect for their personal limits is not forthcoming. Their boundaries, instead of being honored as expressions of self-respect, are treated as obstacles to be bypassed. This recognition marks a crucial turning point. An empath cannot continue to function healthily in an environment where their boundaries are disregarded. Emotional and psychological energy begins to shift inward. They start to conserve their attention, carefully deciding where it is safe to invest themselves. This process is not sudden. It is a gradual tightening of the self, a protective response to repeated exposure to disregard. As the empath enforces these internal recalibrations, a subtle transformation occurs. They begin to step back emotionally and sometimes physically. Communication that once flowed effortlessly now becomes selective. Emotional availability is measured rather than automatic. The empath is not withdrawing out of anger or spite. They are realigning themselves with the principle that their well-being cannot be secondary to another person's disregard. Repeated boundary violations also teach an empath an essential truth about relationships. Reciprocity is fundamental. Connection without mutual respect for limits is not connection at all. It is an extraction of energy, a one-sided emotional investment that eventually becomes unsustainable. Empaths who thrive on genuine, balanced relationships quickly sense when this equilibrium is absent. When they do, the choice to disengage is less a decision than a natural consequence of preserving self-respect and inner integrity. This step toward disappearance is often quiet. Empaths rarely announce a dramatic departure. Instead, they gradually reduce involvement, reclaiming time, energy, and attention for themselves. This is the paradox of their departure. It is invisible to those who never recognize the importance of the boundaries being crossed, yet profoundly impactful. The empath's exit leaves a void that can only be understood through reflection on what has been lost. Their presence, their care, and the emotional depth they naturally bring to relationships. Ultimately, when an empath's boundaries are ignored, their disappearance is not reactive but restorative. It signals the reclaiming of personal sovereignty, the assertion that emotional generosity must be reciprocated by respect, and that connection cannot survive without mutual recognition of limits. It is the silent demonstration of self-respect, a profound statement that the empath will no longer compromise the integrity of their inner life. In the end, boundaries are not barriers. They are the conditions of survival. When those conditions are violated repeatedly, the empath does not argue indefinitely. They disappear. And in that disappearance lies not loss, but the quiet power of self-preservation, clarity, and the unwavering recognition that their emotional life is theirs to protect. At a certain point in their journey, an empath begins to see patterns clearly. This recognition is often gradual, a quiet accumulation of awareness that eventually becomes undeniable. Empaths are naturally inclined to give others the benefit of the doubt. They look for explanations, seeking reasons behind behaviors that feel hurtful or confusing. They may tell themselves, perhaps they're stressed, perhaps they didn't mean it that way, perhaps it's just a misunderstanding. Empaths are skilled interpreters of emotion, adept at finding context, nuance, and meaning, even in the most chaotic interactions. But there comes a moment when the pattern emerges so clearly that the empath can no longer ignore it. The repeated invalidations, manipulations, boundary crossings, and exploitations stop feeling like isolated incidents and start to form a coherent narrative. The empath begins to perceive the structure behind the behaviors, the predictable cycles of control, deception, and disregard. What once felt random or personal now appears as a consistent and pattern dynamic. This moment of clarity is both painful and liberating. It is painful because it forces the empath to confront a reality they may have hoped did not exist. For years, they may have believed that understanding, patience, or compassion could change the other person, that empathy alone could bridge the gap between their own integrity and the dysfunction they are witnessing. But the pattern reveals a truth that is often impossible to deny. Some behaviors are not accidental, and some people are not willing to change. With clarity comes a powerful shift in perception. The empath no longer needs to constantly interpret, rationalize, or justify. They can see the situation objectively. The emotional haze that once obscured judgment begins to lift. This clarity allows the empath to separate what is within their control from what is not. They begin to understand that the responsibility for the other person's behavior does not belong to them. No amount of empathy, explanation, or effort can alter someone who is unwilling or incapable of genuine reflection. Recognizing the pattern also illuminates the cost of continued engagement. The empath sees how their energy, patience, and care have been consumed by attempts to manage, repair, or understand behaviors that are fundamentally unchangeable. This realization often sparks a profound internal recalibration. They begin to prioritize their own emotional well-being over the hope of influencing the other person. In essence, they start to reclaim the life and energy that has been quietly siphoned away. The process of recognizing the pattern is not about judgment or hostility. It is about truth, an unflinching observation of what is without the distortions of hope, fear, or denial. Once the empath internalizes this understanding, the path toward disappearance becomes natural. They no longer invest in cycles that deplete them. They no longer attempt to reconcile with behaviors that erode their sense of self. They disengage, not with drama, but with quiet decisiveness. This recognition also empowers the empath in other ways. It restores trust in their own perceptions and intuition. Having seen the pattern, they no longer doubt their instincts or question their emotional responses. Their clarity becomes a shield, a framework for discerning which relationships are worth nurturing and which are fundamentally incompatible with their well-being. Ultimately, the moment an empath sees the pattern is a pivotal turning point. It marks the transition from reactive participation to conscious withdrawal. It signals that the empath will no longer tolerate being caught in cycles of manipulation, disregard, or exploitation. Their disappearance is a natural consequence of this newfound clarity, a deliberate act of self-preservation and integrity. In the end, the empath does not vanish out of spite or anger. They disappear because they have finally seen the structure of what has been happening all along. And in that disappearance lies the power of truth, the reclamation of energy, and the quiet assertion that their emotional life is theirs to protect. One of the most profound and transformative reasons an empath disappears from a relationship is when their self-respect becomes stronger than their attachment. For an empath, attachment is not merely a casual feeling. It is a deep, almost instinctual connection. They bond emotionally with those around them in ways that are intense, often absorbing the other person's joys, pains, and fears as if they were their own. This capacity to connect is a gift, but it can also become a vulnerability when it meets repeated disregard, manipulation, or exploitation. For a long time, an empath may endure situations that most people would consider intolerable. They may rationalize hurtful behavior, minimize their own pain, or overcompensate in an attempt to maintain the relationship. They often hope that love, patience, or understanding can bridge the gap, that their emotional labor can correct or soften another person's shortcomings. Yet there is a threshold beyond which attachment alone cannot justify continued compromise. This threshold is defined by self-respect. Self-respect for an empath is not simply pride or ego. It is the recognition of their inherent worth, the acknowledgement that their emotional boundaries, needs, and values are not negotiable. It is the internal voice that says, I deserve honesty, I deserve consistency, I deserve respect. This voice may be faint at first, overpowered by attachment, hope, or loyalty. But over time, and often through repeated experiences of being hurt, it grows stronger. It becomes a compass pointing toward preservation rather than sacrifice, toward integrity rather than self erasure. The moment self respect eclipses attachment, the empath undergoes a quiet but irrevocable shift. They begin to disengage emotionally, not as a reaction of anger or revenge, but as a deliberate act of alignment with their own truth. They no longer attempt to justify, explain, or mediate someone else's behavior. Their care remains, but it is redirected inward toward nurturing themselves rather than sustaining a relationship that devalues them. This transformation is subtle yet profound. An empath may still feel a bond, a longing, or even sorrow for the person they are leaving behind, but these emotions no longer dictate their choices. The attachment remains as an emotional fact, but it no longer carries the power to compromise their well-being. They recognize that remaining connected in a dynamic that erodes their self-worth is incompatible with the life they intend to cultivate. Importantly, this stage of withdrawal is often quiet and invisible. Empaths rarely make dramatic confrontations or public declarations. Their disappearance is measured, intentional, and dignified. It is a reflection of the internal authority they have claimed, the authority to prioritize their own integrity over the demands of a relationship that fails to honor it. By stepping away, they protect the emotional space necessary to heal, reflect, and rebuild in alignment with their own values. This turning point also carries a profound lesson about human connection. The empath's departure is not evidence of weakness or abandonment. It is evidence of deep insight and courage. It demonstrates an understanding that relationships must be reciprocal and that the preservation of one's own dignity is the foundation upon which healthy connections are built. They do not vanish because they do not care. They vanish because they finally care enough about themselves to refuse further compromise. Ultimately, when an empath's self-respect outweighs attachment, their disappearance becomes inevitable. It is a natural, even necessary, evolution of emotional maturity. The empath steps away not in bitterness, but in quiet assertion of their worth. In this act lies a profound reminder. True empathy is powerful, but it is sustainable only when paired with self-respect. To honor oneself is not selfish. It is the only way to honor the gift of connection without losing oneself in the process. And in that decisive moment, the empath vanishes, not as a punishment, but as a testament to the unassailable truth that self-respect is stronger than any bond that diminishes it.